Good morning, everybody. The pivot to Asia. The term is 10 years old now, and arguably for most of those 10 years, it's been more of a figure of speech than a rhetorical device, than concrete policy. Arguably, that's changed under the Biden administration. In the last year, even amid efforts to combat the coronavirus pandemic, to reestablish transatlantic ties, to extricate the U.S. from Afghanistan, even amid all that, there's been a real concerted effort to re-energize ties with Asia, to refocus U.S. attention, commitment, investments in this region. You see this in the Quad, which the U.S. has tried to reinvigorate to use to address vaccine shortages and to supply chain security issues and so on. You see it in AUKUS, the partnership with the U.S., with the UK and Australia to deliver nuclear submarines to Australia. And all of this, quite openly, the goal is to establish an order in Asia that is friendly to U.S. interests and values, and that is capable of counterbalancing a rising China. So the question, Kevin, maybe I can start with you. The question is this stabilizing or destabilizing? Is this what the region needs to see, wants to see, or is it pushing us closer towards conflict?
On balance, what I see is it's stabilizing. And because the concept of stability hangs on an axiom in international relations, which is the balance of power. It's a Kissingerian view, but also happens to be my view as well. And when you are therefore looking at a series of actions in East Asia to redress emerging power imbalances, which is rise of China, that's achieved by a recommitment to the US military, in particular its naval capabilities. It's the reinvigoration of US alliances, in which there are 5 treaty partners in Asia. And then thirdly, it's the new emerging strategic architecture as well, the Quad and most recently AUKUS. All of those are direct reactions to China's rise and a objective and perceived adverse direction in the balance of power. So if stability is achieved by a balance of power, then I think overall this is stabilizing. On prosperity, I would say not yet, and that's because the nature of the US administration, and in particular the nature of the United States Congress, and its protectionist center of gravity, has prevented this administration from re-engaging the region in trade. The decision on TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, was disastrous. China is now applying to join it. The fact that China is now a party to RCEP, another pan-regional trade agreement, this is the hole in the midst of the American strategy. And our American friends in the White House know this, which is why we've had at this conference Gina Raimondo, very able Commerce Secretary, seeking to stitch together a new Indo-Pacific economic strategy, anchored, I think, in what will become a strategy on digital trade and digital commerce. That's good. So on prosperity, however, it requires the re-engagement on the economy and trade, and that is still waiting to be seen.
Merritt, maybe you can pick up there with the economy. This is an area where Biden is much more similar to his predecessor, Donald Trump, than to his former boss, President Obama, right? There's an unwillingness or inability to push the free trade here. There are efforts to find alternatives, but can the U.S. really be a viable partner to countries here if we're not willing to open access to our markets?
Well, thank you. A pleasure to be here. I agree with what Kevin just said. I think, but when I look at this region, I see a region where the United States has a profound commitment and history, multi-layered, on the security side, on the economic, foreign direct investment. U.S. firms are now the greatest stock of FDI is from the U.S., second Japan, third China, deep trade relations, cultural ties, student ties, technological. So I see the U.S. as deeply in Asia, and the vitality of this region, it's the highest growth anywhere in the world since the financial crisis. So more and more firms are interested in coming here, in So I think it would be a mistake to limit an assessment of America's commitment to Asia and effectiveness in Asia to these willingness to engage in trade agreements. And I would also say that the Biden administration has said very plainly, I think, you know, that it would try to cooperate where it can with China, compete where it must, that the first priority was getting its own house in order, that it wanted to negotiate from a position of strength, it had to focus on the domestic agenda. Those are mighty challenges. So I think there's a timing and sequencing question here that at least leaves me with the expectation that more is to come. And I think we heard this week some very intriguing ideas. Now, actually, President Trump incorporated, I would say, 85% of CPTPP in the USMCA, and then took some features further. So every administration, I think, tends to want to have their agreement, you know, their initiatives, and I would expect that to take shape. Now, but it's more than, I think, just whether new regionals will be launched, and I'm hoping that a digital framework will be developed because Asia hasn't waited for the United States. It's moving. And there are real opportunities to create new frameworks that matter for the future. But I think Asian countries also want the U.S. to be engaged multilaterally. And it's interesting, in my 3 days here, I have not heard a word about the fact there'll be a multilateral, you know, summit coming up, the MC12 in a week and a half. So, you know, will the U.S. re-engage that at some level? I think one doesn't have to launch profound negotiations, but re-engage on issues that matter to the world and to Asia, certainly, I think, on my mind.
All right, show that commitment. That's what you do. Bilahari, and I turn to you next.
Yeah.
You recently wrote that the Biden administration's approach to Asia is again very similar to the Trump administration's. That it's still transactional. It's a more polite form of transactionalism, but there's still a price to be paid by Asian countries for U.S. support. Is that price valid? Is it worth paying?
First of all, I agree with what Mr. Rudd and Ms. Janow have just said. But let's put things in perspective, right? I dislike this term pivot to Asia because it kind of implies that you were not here and you came back, right? Actually, you have never left, right? I agree with Mr. Rudd that there is a big hole in U.S. strategy on the trade side, on the economic side, but it's a multilateral hole. The U.S. is still a very important economic partner to most of us in Asia, right? With very few exceptions, including China, by the way, right? So let's put that in perspective. Now, I think after the Cold War, after the long engagement adventures in the Middle East, post 9/11, it is quite natural that the U.S. focus will be domestic. And that's true of Mr. Obama, because when he said, let's have change, he wasn't really talking about change abroad, he was talking about change at home, right? And that's why people voted for him. So let's put that in perspective. So every country's foreign policy is transactional to a certain degree. During the Cold War, because there was an existential threat, the US was prepared to be much more generous than it is now. But that's quite natural. And I think we have to accept that. When Mr. Biden says, I want to consult with friends, partners, and allies, he's not consulting with us because we're all good-looking and natural and charming people. He's consulting us to find out what we can do together. And I think we in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, have, in my view anyway, not sufficiently realized that. We keep saying that we are central, and we are rather pleased when people say you are central. But if we really want to be central, we'll have to do something about it. It's not enough to talk about being central. And that is a slight difference. Mr. Trump was disruptive, but as I said, and I think it's an important point that should be stressed, the US never left. The big adjustment of US policy in Asia was after the Vietnam War,
yes,
when it moved to being the offshore balancer rather than the direct intervener. And since then, and that's almost half a century ago, the US has been pretty consistent in that role as offshore balancer. So let's put things in perspective.
Professor Rudd, let me follow up on that. Bilahari has also written that as an offshore balancer, you're in a very difficult position. What you're offering is too hot for some people, too cold for others. It's a Goldilocks thing. Is this sort of questioning of whether the U.S. pivot is going too far, hasn't gone far enough, is that just sort of an inevitable part of being a superpower that is coming in from outside the region?
I take a very sort of, I think, objective view of how do we best secure our future as a region. And if there is no strategic stability, the bottom line is we'll soon feel it and know it and experience it, and it will affect everything. And we've been through those periods in the past in our region. As Bilahari said, prior to the fall of Saigon, this region was a different barrel of fish. And most of the economic growth here has occurred since the fall of Saigon because the underpinning strategic stability has remained in place. So yeah, the United States is going to cop criticism, as you said, on the Goldilocks principle all the time. But the sober heads in the region, in every ASEAN capital, and in Tokyo, and in Seoul, and in Delhi, and in Canberra, are looking at one core equation, which is, do we see a net reinvestment of American military, economic, and technological power into the region, or is the United States beginning to slide out of that by one form or another? And so far, our net assessment is the former, not the latter. But let me tell you, all the hardheads in the region count every rivet and every ship. We count every rivet and every aircraft. We look carefully at the relative size of American GDP against that of the Chinese, the trade footprint, we look at the investment footprint, we look at the capital markets footprint, and we look at where the supply chains are going on semiconductors. That's what's counted. That actually equals, in aggregate, stability. China, of course, pursuing its grand strategy, is seeking to upset that apple cart. That's what great powers do when they're on the rise. This is not a China phenomenon, it's a great power phenomenon. And so therefore, the one thing which will, I think, preserve aggregate stability, which enables, therefore, the region to prosper economically, is to ensure that these strategic fundamentals remain in order. Of course, we know what the tripwires are, vis-à-vis Taiwan and the rest, but the best way to prevent a Taiwan scenario from going from the theoretical discussions into a real living national security nightmare and generating a general war is through effective American and Taiwanese and allied deterrence.
Mayor, on that point about how much attention the region pays to every move from the U.S., every statement, every rivet, as you say, that's a tough standard to meet, especially when we have our own politics that are disrupted right now, shall we say, unpredictable. How do you persuade Asian countries that they can trust that these policies are going to carry through into the next administration and the one after that and the one after that?
Well, I'm not sure how we convince countries except through our actions. So when you have senior officials coming and talking about the themes that we've been hearing about, I think that's reassuring. When you have American firms continuing to invest and hire locally and engage, I think that's very reassuring. When we develop these new frameworks of a hybrid nature, such as the Quad, I think perhaps that can be reassuring. So those are, I think, all healthy steps, and they're reinforced by the commercial business activity. So I think Hank Paulson, when he stresses the power of business, it's not abstract. I think it's part of the glue that is holding us. But so too is immigration, students, education. multi-layered forms of it, I think, should be giving confidence. And I agree with Bilahari that, of course, the man who coined the term pivot is in the White House, but I think the U.S. has never left.
Is there a way to make that clearer? I mean, as you say, the U.S. has never left. The stock of U.S. investment here is higher than any other country. Bilateral relationships are quite strong, but it's really not appreciated so well. Maybe this is a problem with the media, but how do you put that into a narrative for the region? That
look, I think it is better appreciated now than before, for the reasons Mr. Rudd said. Singapore has never been shy about saying that the U.S. is a vital element in any strategic balance in the whole region. Right? Now, some of our neighbors, for reasons of their own, usually domestic reasons, are not willing to be so open in articulating this idea. But there's a better appreciation. Now, in 1990, after a combination of Filipino domestic politics and natural disaster forced the U.S. military out of Subic and Clark Airfield, we offered the use of our facilities because we thought it was important to have at least a symbolic presence in Southeast Asia. And in 1990, we signed an MOU to that effect. Some of our neighbors reacted hysterically. Right? Fast forward, 2019, we renewed that MOU. Not a whimper. They're not prepared to say so, but they now understand that this idea that U.S. is a vital element of any strategic balance, and without balance, there is no prosperity, there is no stability, is not just an eccentric Singaporean idea, but a strategic reality that you may not be able to articulate it, but you understand it better, because the situation has changed, right?
So you've also pointed out that these countries themselves are agents, right? They have agency, they have influence here. What can they do to contribute to this stability, to sort of prevent potential miscalculations, potential tensions?
I agree with Bilahari, by the way, on this question of separating out constantly declaratory statements out of Southeast Asian capitals from what's their actual operational view. We just got to understand there's politics and there's diplomacy, there's in domestic politics, and there is the core strategic view. And the core strategic view in all, I can't say 10 ASEAN capitals, but at least 8 out of 10 and probably 9, is that it's great to have Uncle Sam around and back. Second point, the giant elephant in the room is actually not the one that's the subject, the title of this session. The giant elephant in the room is the guy with the pink face in the United States, Donald Trump. Does he come back directly or in another form in 2024? Now, this will not be a fundamental game changer in terms of pan-regional views of American reliability, but it will be a big one. Because it brings into sharp focus the future of the Republican Party on national security strategy in Asia long term. There's enough ballast within the US military and elsewhere to offset, and business to offset radical changes in administration direction. But I've got to say, most of us were shaken by the Trump experience in one form or another. Some of us were more candid about it than others, but I think operationally, how the hell did this happen? How did January the 6th happen? How did the pandemic management implode so badly? There was a shaking of confidence in America. So as I look to the Republicans in the United States, you have a massive responsibility as a traditional party of national security to reclaim the platform for yourself. And finally, on the region, if you're sitting in Beijing, and I spent a lot of my life trying to understand how Beijing views the region and the world and views the United States, because that's half of the picture. They will now be looking at the fact that we've seen the emergence of the Quad from virtually nothing a year or two ago into something much more robust. They'll be looking at the emergence of AUKUS. They'll be looking at the re-strengthening of the bilateral security arrangements with the 5 treaty partners. and with other friends like Singapore and partners in the region. The hardheads in Beijing will be saying, we have, through our aggregate addition to our own power, but also through the assertiveness of our strategy, given rise to much of this. They won't admit that publicly, but that's actually the internal take. And as a consequence, there will be a discussion, at least for the year ahead, as to whether this has been entirely wise strategy. Do I think they'll change strategy? Tactically, yes. Fundamentally, probably not. But your question was, what has the region been doing? I think that's been manifest. And on the ASEAN point, while they may say things about the Quad and say things about AUKUS, what is kind of interesting is the relative degree of silence about it, particularly given the historical, as it were, neutrality and non-alignment of as ASEAN as an entity. And that's because these regional security institutions now afford Southeast Asia greater levels of political maneuverability with Beijing than perhaps they had before.
Interesting. So would you agree that actually being a little more forward-leaning for countries in the region is safer for them? You know,
yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, not everybody can do the same things, right, nationally. Yeah. But I think there is a better appreciation that everybody needs a good relationship with Beijing. But the necessary condition for that is to have Americans around.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that is understood. Now, what each country is willing to do nationally is different. That you have domestic politics, you have your own considerations. Singapore can do one thing, Vietnam can do something else, Indonesia something. That will naturally be different from country to country. But I think the understanding that the necessary condition for having a close relationship with China, which everybody needs, is to have the Americans around and have a close relationship or some sort of relationship with America.
Okay. And does that, I mean, if the U.S. knows that that's what countries here are looking for, what they need, what other things can we offer if not trade, right? I mean, China can offer quick, I wouldn't say cheap, but quick infrastructure deals. We've tried to move on that front, but have had trouble. Should we move away from trying to compete head-to-head on things like that and focus more on digital, strengthening health systems, you know, other areas of comparative advantage?
Well, thank you. I do think that what you're saying, Bilahari, is important. And there will be tensions as a result. And if the United States, and what I hear when I'm here in the region all the time is, it is very challenging if the U.S. takes policy actions that make Asian countries feel they have to make a choice. That is a very uncomfortable place to be. And so I think, you know, we should be creating a positive agenda in the region that has its own dynamic and is not forcing choice, although there will be points of tension inescapably, one must recognize. So what is that positive agenda? I do think that the dynamism here around the digital economy, the absence of rule frameworks, yet the emergence of regulatory systems that are trying to think about these very domestic questions around privacy and security and the digital economy, you know, are rich for cooperation. And we've seen that already through the regional initiative on digital economic partnership frameworks. But those are still early stages, and there's a lot of work to be done to really make things interoperable for the future. There's also a lot of work to be done around cybersecurity, privacy norms, and so I think those are among the areas. We heard Secretary Raimondo talk about supply chain and also around environment-related measures. That too, I think, I'm quite intrigued coming out of COP26 about blended finance structures and what they could bring in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think there is a positive agenda. It will take a lot of work.
Okay. If I could just reinforce what Meredith's just said. She's eloquently described what now is a huge American opportunity in terms of digital commerce. and frankly digital security and digital regulation as the explosion of digital commerce becomes a global and pan-regional reality. That's one. But she just also touched on supply chains. If the question is what more can be done in the region, what more can be done by the United States, it's this. China, as I read their new policy of national economic self-reliance, Zili Gongsheng, it's underway. If you read the text, Chinese are moving towards secure supply chains for themselves. Now, the United States, for parallel national security reasons, is moving not just in technologies but in other areas to a re-engineering of its own supply chains and that of its allies. Here is a concrete benefit to be delivered to this region, right across Southeast Asia. Rather than simply by, the boys from Boise, Idaho saying, bring it all back home, bring it to your friends, allies and partners into the region. This actually adds to economic growth in the region, it adds to prosperity in the region, and it comes off the back of American strategy as well. And finally, your point about climate change and renewable energy. The global focus will now come onto Asia, coming out of Glasgow. It's where the big emitters are. So there is a huge agenda to be led by the United States and some of its friends and allies and partners, unfortunately not my own country, Australia, in bringing about a renewable energy revolution across this continent, this hemisphere. And China is constrained because of its acute coal dependency and its own concerns about energy security. There is a huge opportunity here for American and allied leadership in bringing this hemisphere into the renewable energy resolution so that we have an Asia carbon neutral 2050. And if that happens, frankly, as the Australian poets would say, we're buggered. We're not going to get there.
Can I say something about this idea of not wanting to choose? Right? Yeah. There is always agency. Even the smallest country has agency. Otherwise, Singapore wouldn't exist, So when we say we don't want to choose, what we really mean is we don't see any need to neatly align our interests across all domains in one direction. Some of our interests will take us in the direction of China, some in the direction of Australia, Japan, the United States, India, Botswana, right? That's what we want. We have agency, and the US presence gives us that agency. Because if there's no balance, there's no agency for small countries.
Right. I think on that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you all very much for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.